had Ukraine been given what they needed in terms of aircraft and tanks that they've now been given, then the Russians would have been kicked out of Ukraine a long time ago. So what's happened now is that the West's policy and influence on Ukraine has diminished because Zelensky's attack was launched in ignorance of the West. He didn't tell NATO that he was going to do it. Otherwise, they would have tried to intervene or stop him somehow or other. So the West policy of non-escalation, of not provoking Russia more than necessary, has failed, and this means that Zelensky is now in the driving seat.
Let's take a closer look at that with the military historian and analyst Peter Caddick-Adams. Peter, good evening. Vladimir Putin warning there of a wider conflict, but I guess he will.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is that he's blaming the West, and this is in some ways, to his mind, implicating the West far more firmly in the struggle with Ukraine. In fact, I think it's just the opposite. The West's policy has been always sort of predicated on no escalation, and it was they who put the barriers in to Zelensky, to Kiev, about not escalating, so not invading Russia, and drip feeding them the sort of weapons they needed, like tanks and aircraft. And it's quite clearly the case that had Ukraine been given what they needed in terms of aircraft and tanks that they've now been given, then the Russians would have been kicked out of Ukraine a long time ago. So what's happened now is that the West's policy and influence on Ukraine has diminished because Zelensky's attack was launched in ignorance of the West. He didn't tell NATO that he was going to do it. Otherwise, they would have tried to intervene or stop him somehow or other. So the West policy of non-escalation, of not provoking Russia more than necessary, has failed, and this means that Zelensky is now in the driving seat.
Right. Okay. Putin is the first Russian leader to lose territory to a foreign power since the Second World War. This is a really, really big and potentially quite damaging moment for him, isn't it?
Yeah, I think he's lost an enormous amount of face, and the whole week he has seen him sort of wondering quite how to react to that, because he doesn't have an instant solution. If he takes all his crack troops away from the Eastern Front fighting Ukraine, then that'll give the Ukrainians the advantage and the ability then to start moving westwards themselves. So actually, President Zelensky has pulled a real blinder here, because Putin's men can't be in two places at the same time. I don't think the Ukrainians will stay there because they won't be able to sustain that advance. I mean, what they've done is that they've occupied as much territory in a week as Russia has gained in Ukraine in 2 years. I mean, that's a hell of an achievement.
Oh, that is extraordinary when you put it like that, isn't it, Peter? Can we just consider the role of Alexei Dumin in this? Somebody who has been a familiar character for those who've been watching Moscow. He was, as Tom was just explaining to us, a bodyguard of Vladimir Putin at one point. It's believed, to legend has it, that he saved him from a bear at some point and sort of muscled his way into Putin's inner circle. He has been tasked with trying to lead the sort of resistance, the fight back in this Russian territory, and quite significant, Peter, because he is seen as a successor to Vladimir Putin.
Well, he's seen by the West as a successor. I don't think he's seen necessarily by Putin as a successor, because the one thing. No, because the one thing we're very, very painfully aware of is that Putin doesn't really have an anointed successor who's going to follow him. And that makes the whole situation in Russia extremely worrying and troublesome for the West, because we simply don't know who's going to sort of follow in his wake. So we may like to sort of pick out these people. Don't forget Prigozhin, who's running Wagner, was sort of seen in the same light. Shoigu, who's sort of the defense minister, is one of his sort of closest confidants. I mean, he should have been sacked ages ago for non-achievement. But he's there because he's a pal, not because he's a competent defense minister. Right. Gerasimov is at the top of the tree as the senior military uniformed officer overseeing defense. But he and the regime go back for a long, long time, and he's incredibly loyal. So it's very difficult for the West to sort of start picking out these individuals who we think are being aligned for future control of the regime. It doesn't work like that. This is just like Hitler in the Second World War. Who was his designated successor, and the deputy Führer disappeared long before the Second World War ended. Right. So we don't have that kind of visibility, and I'm not even sure that Putin does at the moment.
Okay, that's interesting. Let's just quickly turn our attention to the Middle East, Peter, if you'll allow, because Antony Blinken, US Secretary of State, was due to make a trip to the Middle East this week. He has now cancelled it amidst the unrest. We've also heard from Iran today, who've effectively, or Iranian media at least, reporting that the government there have dismissed Western concerns or Western encouragement not to escalate the tensions with Israel and to sort of, I suppose, temper their retaliation. We're also hearing tonight that Hamas will not attend negotiations planned in Doha on Thursday. It doesn't feel there's much good news coming out of the Middle East in the last 12 hours.
No, but I think we've got to put this in context. If Iran was going to make some kind of really, really alarming retaliation of global significance, they would have done it by now. And they clearly are aware that if they overstep the mark, then that drags them into a war, which they cannot win. I mean, Iran doesn't want a war. It just simply doesn't have the technology. It doesn't have the military equipment. What Iran is a regional player. There's no way that Iran wants to go to a war with America, which is a global player. It's a complete mismatch. Iran's enemy, if there is one, is Saudi Arabia, its rival for dominance in the Middle East, and Saudi is quite rightly and cleverly taking a back seat. So Israel's aware of this, is pushing things. Iran is pushing just as much further back. What I suspect is there'll be some kind of sort of super missile attack against the Iron Dome that surrounds Jerusalem that will probably be defeated, and honor will be satisfied all round. Lebanon is far more vulnerable, and there may be I mean, that's really the area that we have to worry about. But I think we are overestimating Iran's capability for aggression. And don't forget, they've got a brand new president in place, and he's under pressure to retaliate. But of course, he was elected as a moderate, or by Iranian terms as a moderate. So he's got to work out where he stands in all of this. So I think we are outside this tent, and we're looking in, and we're trying to draw our own conclusions that don't necessarily fit with the Iranian Palestinian mindset.
Okay. Peter, thank you for your time tonight. I appreciate it. Peter Caddick-Adams, who is a military historian and analyst, as I say, more from Tom Ball. Quite the dispatch again from the front line. Well, not quite the front line. He's sort of in Ukraine, pretty much the sort of centre of Ukraine, but speaking to officials there and ordinary folk and those who are travelling up to the front line for Ukraine. Really worth reading from Tom in your copy of The Times tomorrow. Ukrainian forces tonight remain in control of what they claim is 1,000 square kilometres of Russian territory. President Vladimir Putin has now described the incursion as crazy and intended to intimidate society and undermine stability. He also says it's evidence that Russia was at war with the West. Well, earlier I spoke to The Times' Tom Ball in Ukraine.
As has been the case pretty much every day for the last week, the Russians have been claiming that the advance has been halted, and yet both the Ukrainians and also independent sourcing, stuff like geolocated footage, reports from military bloggers suggest otherwise, that they have continued to advance, with some reports suggesting that they're now more than 20 miles within the Russian border. And just yesterday, the head of the Ukrainian army said that the Ukrainians were now in control of about 1,000 square kilometres, or about 400 square miles of Russian territory.
I mean, it's a bit surprising, this, isn't it, Tom? With each advance, I mean, the initial incursion surprised us, but each advance surprising again.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that initially they weren't met with much resistance at all. they evidently chose the weakest spot that they thought along the 600-mile border between Russia and Ukraine. But even so, it was poorly defended, mostly by conscripts who never expected to be in the thick of the fighting. And as has been speculated quite widely, and I think is probably the case, Ukraine is one of the major aims of this incursion is to try and draw Russian troops off the eastern front to relieve some of the pressure on Ukraine's defenders there. But it appears that Russia's been quite reluctant to do so. So the kind of crack troops that you would expect to be pouring in now to shore up the situation haven't come as quickly as I think Ukraine at first thought. So they've been able to continue to advance. And I think that probably will start to slow up in the next few days as Russia inevitably does start to bring in much more hardened, seasoned fighters, as it already has done to some extent.
And you're reporting in Times tonight how this is being met in Russia. Vladimir Putin attempting to frame this quite clearly as a war with the West.
Quite unsurprisingly, it clearly plays well with the Russian. Clearly is beneficial to him because it enables him to tell the Russian people that the war in Ukraine is justified, because in claiming that the West is somehow behind this and somehow orchestrating this, it gives ballast to the argument that Ukraine is a puppet of NATO who is perfidiously attempting to harm Russia.
Also interesting, Tom, the involvement of Alexei Dumin and the role that he's playing in trying to defend, I suppose, Russia and where Vladimir Putin has placed him here. Just give us a bit of a sense of who this guy is and why his involvement in this moment of history is interesting to us.
Initially, he was a bodyguard for Putin, and he claimed once that he had fended a bear off Putin when it approached his residence about 22 years ago. And from there, seemingly, his continued to rise. He was made deputy head of the GRU, which is Russia's military intelligence service. He was then briefly a deputy defense minister. He was also thought to be heavily involved with Wagner. So he's been in and around defense for quite a while, and it is hotly tipped to potentially become a successor to Putin one day, and is clearly within the inner circle. So the fact that Putin has decided that this man is the one to lead the response is, I think, is certainly a suggestion that Putin is wanting to bring control over the situation within his inner circle, within his immediate team, rather than allowing the security services and the army to oversee it as they have been so far.
Yeah, a really interesting point in that, Tom, isn't it? Which is that they are, clearly he's wanting to extend some authority to Alexei Dumin, which is interesting to follow his trajectory, but also cracks showing here in the relationship between Vladimir Putin and those who are currently leading for him on the front line.
Yeah, the army's coming for quite a kicking, and in particular, Gerasimov, who leads the army. There have been some people saying that Gerasimov did have intelligence about a build-up on the border in the months before, and chose not to act on it. But Moscow's elites are such a vociferous environment, with people constantly attempting to take each and every other one down, that the fact that everybody's going for one particular member of the elite is not necessarily surprising, because this often happens in times of crises where people look to find a scapegoat. I think it's clear that there is a certain amount of displeasure with the response, which is, by most standards, not being good by the army. And I think that's that Putin decided to designate this a counter-terror operation, which would allow the FSB and the National Guard to intervene, as well as bringing it under the control of Dumin. I think is a suggestion that he's dissatisfied with the army's response to it.
Tom Ball, who's in Ukraine for The Times this week. You can read more from Tom in your copy of The Times tomorrow. Russia warns of far wider conflict after incursion is the headline.